Okay. Who is extremely excited to meet the genius book author of the Kweller Prep SAT books? Who is super excited to meet the genius book author? Tell me. I want to hear, type it, or rather type it. Okay. Who is super excited to meet the genius book author? Who's excited? How old are you, Douglas?
32. I just turned 32 a few days ago.
And how old are you when you wrote your first book?
I was like 24. I started writing, but 25 it was published.
24 years old, he started writing, and 25 years old, he was already a published author, helping kids get into the best colleges in the whole country. Who's impressed? Is that cool? I think that's pretty cool. Okay, I am honored to know you. And I'm really happy that we collaborate and we work together over the years. And I love young talent. It's honestly just like one of the most amazing things. And it makes me so happy. I'm really blessed because I get to know such intelligent people who are really young. And the fact that you wrote an SAT book, how many books have you written so far while we're waiting for another few people to join?
I think we did like 10, right? I think it's 4 of them are both books and 6.
Tell me that's not really cool, everyone. He's written 10 books and he's barely 30 years old. That is very impressive. He started at 24. Isn't that amazing? He's a book author. Okay, I'm impressed. I am, right? Isn't that, by the way, kids, if any of you geniuses decide to write a book, just remember to contact me because we can collaborate. All right, so without further ado, I think we have enough people. We have a great turnout. Okay, why don't we get started from here? And I'm really excited. And I totally want to say I'm just so impressed that you are so young and publishing and writing, and that you're part of this company for years now. I'm just want to really share that I'm impressed. Do you mind just sharing your background? And I think let's start with your education. Okay, let's start. Tell us about your education.
All right.
School, what you're up to, like over some of your academics.
Starting from like high school.
Yeah, let's do recent and then reverse back. Okay.
All right. So as you might have seen in the bio that Francis published me. So I just actually got my master's degree from Harvard Graduate School of Education. So I was in the Mind, Brain, and Education program. So I took a lot of classes in like neuroscience and how students learn. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today actually kind of overlap with things that I talked a little bit about in my program. And I actually just revised, not this book, but the grammar book, which we're going to talk about in 2 weeks, using some learning science principles. I just updated that. So that's where
of the Harvard program that you went to is called Mind,
Brain.
Brain.
Yeah, Mind, Brain, and Education. Yeah, they got that. I was like in the last year of it because they just changed the master's programs around, and there were like 13 and now they're only like 4 or 5. So they condensed a bunch of them. So now it's just human development for people who are going to be in the program now. But yeah,
what made you decide to study that field for graduate school?
Well, as you know, like I've been writing books for you for a long time and tutoring, but I was kind of more going just kind of intuitively, kind of what seemed right would be the best way for people to learn, but I didn't really have like a formal education, like this is the way students actually learn best. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of learn like the brain-based research related to how students learn. So I could like better refine my tutoring practices, but also my curriculum. So like I mentioned, like the grammar book in particular, I just made I was going to add to it anyway, but I made a few adjustments to it that I probably wouldn't have otherwise done based on things that I studied in my program.
So you're a book author of 10 different books at Kweller, ready? And just completed a graduate degree during the pandemic at Harvard University in a very competitive program. So now can you kind of go like in reverse? Where did you go to college?
So for my undergrad, I went to Georgetown and I majored in government. So it really didn't have anything to do with test prep. Although over the summers, I did tutor for the SAT. It's like a summer job. And then, I didn't really take any education related courses there though. So I did take one class in psychology though, which is really interesting. So some of what I learned in my program kind of overlapped with that. And actually I'm going to share, when we get to one of the slides, I'm actually going to share like one brief anecdote that my Georgetown psychology professor shared with us as it somewhat relates to reading comprehension stuff very indirectly. That was really it for undergrad. And then I went to high school here in New York, in Long Beach High School. Before that, I think that was all I had to say. Oh, I also did the graduate certificate program. I forgot, 2014 in college counseling. And that was through the University of San Diego Extension Program. So I think I did that 2014. So I did that in between college and my master's.
Can you tell us a little bit about your high school, please? What kind of classes did you take? Did you take certain APs? How were you a school student?
Yeah, so it was a public school where I went to. So they didn't have an IB program yet. They actually, right now it's an IB school, but when I was there, they did have AP classes. So I took 6 AP classes altogether. I think I took AP Euro, AP Calculus, AP Lit, AP Government, AP Spanish Language, and AP US History. And then I also took some college level classes. So I took 2 college music theory classes, college genetics, and I think college accounting. And I believe that was it for the college level stuff. It was a long time ago. But yeah, that's what I took in high school.
So that's a lot of amazing information. And then can you give some advice before we officially start, just in regards to you writing your first book, because that's a really big deal. So, because I guess like you've written about 10 books, a little more, because you've also written exams for us. You've done quite a lot of test development at Kweller. But I guess just because we may have a lot of future book authors right now in the audience, what's your best advice with like starting? Like, how do you start writing a prep book?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, I had been kind of thinking about doing it for a while before I actually did. So the first thing I did, as far as the SAT books, those were the first books I wrote. I waited until like the College Board released a blueprint for the test, because for those of you who don't know, the test was actually changed 6 years ago. So prior to 2016, the test was in a slightly different format. So, and I did teach SAT classes at Kaplan for a year after graduation, but that was still the old version of the SAT. So pretty much after they released a blueprint with the topics, and then they released some sample tests, I like read everything I could about the test just to learn as much as I could. Then I actually just made an outline of what I knew I wanted each chapter to kind of be about before I even started writing. And then I just kind of started like going just like one chapter at a time. And I knew like the topics I wanted to cover and like roughly like what drills I wanted to have in them. But yeah, the first few books were definitely the hardest ones to write. But just once I was actually organized, they weren't terribly bad to write. It was just figuring out how I wanted to structure them. And the other books I did fast. I think you had me write like 2 SHAT books in like 3 months. Which
Your books, and you
like
just written
that was
books
really
for us. So
stressful time. Yeah, having to get those done. I think you told me like in March you needed them by like June. So yeah, that was a lot of work.
yeah, we've definitely given you pressure. I really just want to, share that I'm so happy that you're doing this, and it's truly an honor to know you. I'm going to let you take over. I'm actually going to stop talking. I know it's shocking. The moment is coming. And I'm going to mute myself. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. So like Francis told you, today's webinar is going to be focused on the reading section of the SAT. So each week we're going to focus on a different portion of the test. So before we get into the main webinar, just for the reading section in particular, I just wanted to make a few opening remarks about the section that I think are particularly important to point out. So the reading section is probably the one that I find to be the most interesting, because it's either one that some students just naturally find to be really easy, especially if they read a lot and they can just do really well on it without having to even put in that much effort. But for a lot of other students, especially including some students who are really good students who work hard and they get good grades and take advanced classes, this is a section that they often find to be the most frustrating of the 3. And I think one reason for that is the math and the grammar sections are a lot more rule-oriented, as we're going to see in the next 2 weeks. So a dedicated student who really just takes the time to study the rules and learn from their mistakes could often improve really quickly or relatively quickly on those parts. The reading part doesn't always quite work the same way, because it's not really rules you can memorize. So there are strategies that you could learn that could help you approach the questions and passages more methodically. And I definitely have seen some students make pretty big gains relatively quickly just by kind of changing their approach. However, if you don't actually understand what it is you're reading, or you don't know what the passage is, or you don't know what the questions are really asking, or what all the answer choices are saying, there's really only so far that strategies can get you. And if you're looking to improve your score by more than like 40 points or so, you're probably going to need to actually put in some time increasing your general reading level, which isn't easy to do, but it's definitely doable with work. And kind of like a harsh truth is that a student who could read at a college level, who's never seen an SAT before, is probably going to score higher on the reading part than a student who maybe could only read comfortably at a 10th grade level, but who has been practicing for months. So that's why it's really important that you work on your foundational reading skills in addition to your test prep, kind of depending on your starting point. And yeah, I think that was pretty much all I wanted to say. Oh yeah, and then the other big thing is, so because I consider the reading section to be the most difficult section in the sense that I think it tests the most sophisticated skills in comparison to the math and grammar, this webinar in particular is going to be a lot more advice oriented than the other ones are. So next week at the math webinar, probably fairly quickly within the presentation, we're going to get right into looking at real SAT questions and working through them. But for this webinar, we're probably not going to actually get to that till closer to the halfway point or a little bit after, because I really want to make sure we spend enough time talking about generally things that you can do to improve your reading skills, because ultimately I think that's going to be more valuable in helping you raise your score, as well as helping you just in college and beyond. Depending on what you major in, reading is going to be a very big part of what you're doing in college. So it's important that you have those skills strong, not just for the SAT, but in general, in school and life, possibly your careers as well. So next, I'm just going to give you a brief slide about kind of what we're going to be doing today. So I don't know if things are cut off here. So first, we're going to go through just an overview of the test. So what to expect in terms of the format, the question types, the scoring. Then I'm going to move on to the advice section. So I divided this into two parts. So the first part, I'm going to actually share with you 3 things that I did in middle school and high school that ended up really helping me prepare well for the reading portion of the SAT without actually even realizing I was preparing for it. And then I'm going to end that part by kind of sharing with you advice on suggestions that you can do to help you strengthen your reading skills more generally, to help you prepare for the SAT. Then I'm just going to very briefly provide an introduction to the book, which hopefully you all have, or you will be getting it soon, just kind of explaining a general way that it's structured. And then we're actually going to look at the first chapter quickly, which is more of a mini lesson on just general advice on how to approach the passages and questions. And I'm also going to share in that chapter some common wrong answer types, which I think are important to go over, especially if you're one of those students who often gets narrowed down between the right answer and then one other distractor choice. It's good to know what some of the common traps are and what to look out for. And then finally, I'm actually going to walk you through one passage from the March 2021 SAT. So we're just going to look at the first passage, which is a fiction one. So I'm going to kind of read it out loud to you and annotate it. I already have some notes written in the margins there. And then we're going to actually go through each question one by one and kind of go over the general strategy of how to approach each question and then how we would actually think through each particular question. So we'll start with the test format. So for some of you, this might be complete review. For others of you, this might be new information, but either way, it's good to know what to expect on the test. So the test consists, for the reading portion of the test, which is going to be the very first section that you take on test day, you're going to have 52 reading comprehension multiple choice questions, and they're only 4 choices each. And you have 65 minutes to complete the section. If you qualify for extra time, then you get time and a half. So it's closer to like 98 minutes. And there are going to be 5 passages altogether, but really 6, because 4 of them are single passages that are around 500 to 750 words each, followed by around 10 to 11 questions. But then you're also going to have one set of paired passages, which are always labeled passage 1 and passage 2. And these always deal with some sort of related topic. So you might have 2 authors that have opposite positions on a certain political or philosophical debate, or if it's like a science-based paired passage, maybe you have 2 authors sharing different research on the same broad topic, for example. And these passages are each going to be a little bit shorter than a single passage, but altogether will be around the same length as a normal passage. As far as the text complexity, so the passages do vary in difficulty quite a lot. So that's why it's really common sometimes for students to get a perfect score maybe on a couple of the passages and then the majority wrong on another. So the easier passages are going to typically be at around the 9th or 10th grade level. The more medium ones will be at around an 11th or 12th grade level. And there's generally going to be one passage that's at the post-secondary or college level. And then as far as the genres covered, so all the passages are prose, so there's no poetry for those of you who took the SHSAT and maybe didn't like that. your luck, there's no more poetry on the test. So typically one passage will be a work of fiction, generally the first passage, and that's like the one we're going to look at today. And then usually you'll have about 2 natural science passages and about 1 social science passage. So those could deal more usually with like human behavior or psychology related topics. And then there's 1 piece that's from the Great Global Conversation. That's what the College Board or the test makers call it. But that's basically just a fancy way of saying a primary source document. And these are usually from US history, but sometimes they're from world history. And just as another thing that might be useful to know, so this isn't exactly a hard and fast rule as far as I'm aware, but generally the history passage is going to be an argumentative piece. So the author is usually trying to convince you of something. And then the science pieces, for the most part, will be informational, although you occasionally might get an argumentative one, or it might be an informational one where they kind of report on different viewpoints on an issue, even if the authors themselves don't actually take a stand. All right, so that's it for the test format. So now I'm just going to briefly go into the question types. So I'm not going to go into every single question type that is asked on the SAT, because that would take a really long time to do, and I don't necessarily think it would be that particularly helpful. But in general, though, you could think of the questions as falling into 3 broad question types, and these 3 types actually each correspond to 1 unit in my book. So the first question type, or broad category of question types, I should say, are the information and ideas questions. So these questions are just primarily concerned with your ability to understand the author's message. So what is it that the author is literally saying or implying in the text? So a handful of these questions, not very many, are going to be more big picture questions like main idea or summary questions potentially. But the vast majority of these questions are going to be more close reading questions. And that's a phrase you're going to hear me probably say a few times in this presentation. So questions that really require you to read, at the paragraph and sentence and the word level and understand very deeply what the author is saying. So these questions would include detail questions, inference questions, and even questions involving citing textual evidence, which students sometimes find a little tricky at first, but I actually think there's some of the easier question types once you get comfortable with them. And we're going to actually see 2 questions like that on the test that we look at later today. The next broad category of question types are the rhetoric questions. So these questions are arguably a little bit harder because they're less concerned with what the author is literally saying and more with how the author is saying it and why. So how do authors actually structure and develop their texts? So these questions might involve you analyzing word choice or point of view or purpose. If it's an argumentative piece, they might have you not only analyze what the argument actually is, but how the authors craft their argument. So for example, maybe they use statistics to help make their point more convincing, or maybe they use analogies or appeals to emotion. So it's more analyzing less what the author is saying and more how they're doing it and for what purpose. And then the final question type, which is the rarest question type, are synthesis questions. So these questions involve putting big ideas together in order to make meaning. And there are only 2 types of these questions on the test, and they don't show up on every passage even. So the first type are the paired passage questions. So you might remember on the slide before, I mentioned you're going to have 1 passage or 1 set of passages where you have 2 authors, and it's going to be labeled passage 1 and passage 2 that deal with some sort of related topic. So typically the way these passages work, at least this is what seemed to have been what they've been doing the past few years on the release tests, is you'll usually have around 3 questions that are just on passage 1, and then 3 that are just on passage 2. And these will be very similar to the questions in the first 2 categories I mentioned. But then you're going to probably have around 4 questions or so that actually involve comparing and contrasting the passages with one another. So for example, the question might say, what is the relationship between passage 1 and passage 2? Or what is something both authors disagree about? Or what's something both authors do agree about? Or the most sophisticated questions might be something like, in lines 1 to 4, the author passage 1 says this, how would the author passage 2 likely react to that? So these questions are a little bit more sophisticated because you not only have to understand what each author is saying individually, but you really need to understand how their ideas relate to one another. So they can be a little bit more challenging at times. And then the other type of question are the quantitative analysis questions. So these are questions that involve analyzing figures, typically graphs or charts or tables that accompany a couple of the passages. So you'll probably have about 4 of these questions altogether. And honestly, I would say most of these questions are fairly easy if you read the graphs, as long as you read the charts carefully. But every now and then they do have more sophisticated questions where you actually have to integrate information from the passage with information in the chart. So in other words, in order to get the right answer without guessing, you actually have to look at the passage and the graph. You can't just look at one or the other. So that makes them a little bit more challenging. And then I think the last part before we get into the advice section is just to talk a little bit about the test scoring. So the raw score is a total number of questions that you get right out of 52. And then that's converted to a scaled score that could range anywhere from 10 to 40 points. And that's the score that actually counts towards your grade and that the colleges look at. So then your scaled score from the reading section is added to your scaled score from the writing and language section, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks, and multiplied by 10. So you'll get a final English score that is anywhere from 200 to 800. So the reading only contributes half to your total English score and then a quarter to your actual total SAT score because the math is also out of 800. And then I think there was one other thing I wanted to point out. Oh yeah. So for those of you, if you're familiar with the older version of the test, there used to be a guessing penalty where your raw score, you would get 1 point for each question right, 0 for each question blank, and then negative a quarter point for each question wrong. They got rid of that penalty. So now you get 0 points, whether it's wrong or blank. So you might as well guess on everything, even if you have no idea or you run out of time, because at best it could only help you. And then the last thing I want to talk about with scoring, and I'll probably mention this in the other webinars as well for people who aren't able to come today, has to do with the equating process. So a lot of times parents will ask me, the students I tutor, will be, is there a month that it's easier to take the SAT than others? And I tell them basically some version of yes and no. So the test does vary in difficulty from month to month. So for example, some months might have a really easy English part and a hard math, and other month might be the reverse. Some months both parts might be easy, some months all parts might be hard. However, as far as I can tell, there isn't a particular pattern where like March is easy and May is hard and June is easy again. It seems to be pretty random. But even if it weren't, it doesn't necessarily make that big of a difference in terms of, it shouldn't make that big of a difference in terms of your strategy, because the SAT uses a process known as equating, which is designed to make sure that the scores are roughly equivalent regardless of when you take the test. So a student that has a given skill and ability level on any random day should get about the same score regardless of what version of the test they get. So what they do to account for that is if you just happen to have a more difficult form of the test, then they make the scoring more lenient in terms of how raw scores convert to scaled scores. So for example, on some past months where they've had an unusually hard reading test, 6 questions wrong converted to 38 out of 40, which is pretty close to perfect. And on months where it was unusually easy, converted to 34 out of 40 for that same number wrong. And then other months, it ranged anywhere from 35 to 37, where it was more average. And the reason they do that is because on the months, I guess, where it worked out that 6 wrong was 30 out of 40, the test was likely so hard that even a student with truly outstanding reading skills is still likely to get a bunch of questions wrong because the questions were just that difficult. So that's how they kind of add a little bit measure of fairness to make sure that you're not punished for having a harder form of the test. So in some ways, I actually think it's worse to get an easy test because if you make a careless error, then it could count it counts against you a lot more than it otherwise would. Although I would say on the English part, it's not as big of a factor generally, but the math section actually can really be pretty drastic. When they have the easy versions of the test, the curves could be really, really rough. So it's probably better to not get an easy test if anything. All right, so I think that's it for the general format stuff. So next, I'm going to move on to the advice section that I was telling you about before. All right, so I wanted to share with you, before I give you kind of the things that I think you can do to improve your score, I wanted to share with you kind of the things that I personally credit with helping me raise my reading score. So to be like very upfront, the reading comprehension was probably the part that was easiest for me naturally. So I only had to really focus on studying math. But the reason it was easy for me was because I was doing these other things that I didn't realize at the time, but were actually helping me prepare really well for the reading. So the first thing that I did was I studied vocabulary actively. So this part's a little bit involved, so I'm going to kind of break it down to 3 parts. So first, I'm going to tell you why studying vocabulary is important. Then I'll tell you a little bit about why I actually thought to study vocabulary. And then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what I mean by studying actively. So it's important to study vocabulary because if you're not able to understand about 95% or so of the words that you read in a text, then your ability to understand it starts to become impaired. And if you're not able to understand like a large portion of the words, then you're really going to have a hard time following the text. And I often find that in my tutoring with my students, even among my strongest reading students, when they do get questions wrong, a lot of the time it's because of vocabulary related issues. And that actually happened just this week. One of my students I work with who's doing really well at reading, she usually gets anywhere from like 33 to 35 on like out of 40 on her scaled score. This week, I would say about half of the questions she got wrong were all vocabulary related issues. So in one question, she didn't know what a word in the text meant. In another, she didn't know what a word in the question meant. I think in two others, she didn't know what a word in the answer choice meant. And had the questions just used like more straightforward, just replace those words she didn't know with the words she did know, there's a good chance she would have gotten all of those right. So it's really important that you have a strong vocabulary, because the more words you know, the less likely you are to make vocabulary related errors when you otherwise understand the rest of the text pretty well. So as far as why I actually studied vocabulary, so when I was in middle school, which probably some of you were, I was invited to take the SAT as part of qualify for that Johns Hopkins CTY program. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's just a summer program that allows high school students to take college level courses. So I didn't really do too much preparation in middle school for the SAT because I knew it didn't really matter and the scores were going to be erased anyway once we went to high school. But the only part I actually did decide to study for pretty like deeply was the vocabulary section, which has since been eliminated. But up until 6 years ago, the SAT had what were called sentence completion questions. So basically what they did is they would give you a sentence with one or two blanks, and you had to pick the choice that had the vocabulary words that best fit the blanks. And on the harder questions, they would include a lot of college level words that most high school students and pretty much most middle school students were very unlikely to know unless they actually read a lot or they actually, made an effort to study the words. So I did get review books and I studied words in order to prepare for that. And even though the work I did for that section, at least in 8th grade, really most directly helped me for the sentence completions, it indirectly also helped me a little bit for the reading because a lot of the words that I was studying ended up showing up on the passages and in the questions. So I probably got a few more questions right on the reading comprehension part than I otherwise would have from that. But the thing that really helped me by studying vocabulary was the fact that I studied actively. So I have a little definition here for you, but basically, I don't know if you've talked about this in school, but my Harvard program, we talked a lot about active versus passive learning in a couple of my classes. So essentially passive learning is kind of when some of my professors described it as you're just like an empty vessel. You're just kind of like taking information in and soaking it all in. And while obviously sometimes we have no choice but to do that, especially in school settings, students tend to learn best when they are able to engage in active learning. And this is when you could do active processing. So this allows you, like had a definition here, kind of to like manipulate, modify, and apply your knowledge to help strengthen its representation in your memory. So in the case of vocabulary studying, I really practiced, not just passive learning would be just kind of like studying vocabulary lists and rereading them, which I did, but I also tested myself on the words, which is a form of retrieval practice, which helps you learn better. But I also practiced using the words as much as I could. So there were 3 main ways that I did this. So one way was if I came across words I didn't know in my studies, whether it was in my practice tests or just in a book I was reading for school, I would write it down and look it up. And I would also look up how they're using sentences because sometimes definitions, as you know, could be a little misleading because 2 words might have a similar dictionary definition, but they're actually used differently in context. And then I would try to like think of my own sentences with them. But the 2 things I really did that helped me, probably the main thing was in my school assignments, I practiced using the words I was studying as much as I possibly could. Honestly, probably to the point of overdoing it. Eventually, I did tone that down and write more naturally and just sprinkle in the words as they were appropriate. But those few months where I went really overboard using those words helped me learn them really well. And I also went through a very brief period where I tortured my family in the months leading up to the SAT, practicing the words on them. I stopped doing that once the test was over, but that brief period where I did that actually really did help me learn the words well. And then by the time I had to take the SAT for real in 11th grade, I found that I actually remembered most of the words I studied, so I didn't have to really do that much vocabulary study again. So that's really it for the vocabulary part. And the next 2 things I think are probably the most important, especially the next one. So they're both kind of related to each other. So you remember before how I mentioned close reading is a skill that's tested on the SAT. So I practice close reading a lot with the books that were assigned to me in school. So I don't know how your English classes are set up. I imagine it varies depending on where you go to school. So it might be different for some of you. I know at least with a lot of the students that I have, who I work with in private tutoring, it sounds like a lot of their English classes now are very like discussion and writing heavy. It doesn't sound like they do as much, I don't do a lot of close reading, which are the skills that you actually need to be able to do well on the test. So when I was in high school, middle school, there also probably wasn't really enough focus on like reading comprehension and the way it's tested on the test in terms of like multiple choice questions when you read a passage and then try to answer them. But what we did have a lot of though were closed book multiple choice questions on whatever stories we were reading at the time. So whether it were plays or short stories or novels. So in order to prepare for those tests, not because I was thinking about the SAT or anything, just because I wanted to do well on the test, I would often find myself reading and rereading the chapters multiple times so I could remember everything I could. I would often consult, Spark Notes or some related resource that would explain, that would summarize the books and also analyze them to make sure I didn't miss anything. I would do as many practice quizzes as I could find online. Sometimes I would go to extra help. Occasionally, not very often, but there were a few times where I did actually make my own practice tests as a study tool that helped me study if the text was like really dense and I had the time to do that. I didn't do that too much, but I did it for a few tests, I think in ninth grade. And all of that work that I was putting in simply just to prepare for a regular like ninth grade English test, little did I know it was actually helping me get a lot of practice with the skills that I would need in order to do well on the SAT reading. And I was lucky that I had a good teacher in ninth grade who really pushed us because a lot of she was also an SAT tutor. I think that was part of the reason why. But she also gave us a lot of close reading homework assignments that weren't multiple choice, but we'd have to, answer very specific questions in pretty, in a lot of detail. And doing that also kind of forced me to do close reading to make sure I wasn't, missing anything important from the text. So all of that work that I did with just my school assignments really helped me read in the type of way that I needed to for the test. Whereas some other students were able to maybe get by in the class just by kind of skimming or just reading the summaries online or, and going to class and paying attention. Well, that might have been enough to be able to get like in the 80s or the 90s when it came for the test. When it came time for the SAT, a lot of those students found that the passages were really hard and they weren't used to, reading in that type of way. And then the other place where I got opportunity to do close reading was actually through the Johns Hopkins program. So that's why I took the SAT in middle school, was to be able to do this program. So I just took a 3-week summer course in the summer before 10th grade. And I could have taken a course in pretty much anything. They had like a lot of options, I think like chemistry, biology, math, cryptology. I mean, there are a wide variety of subjects. But I ended up taking a class in philosophy just because I didn't know much about it, but it sounded interesting. And I knew that would be a subject that I would not have the chance to study in school, in high school at least. So I wanted to take something that I wouldn't be able to study until I was in college. And the passages, when we got there, the readings were extremely hard. Like my classmates and I would often laugh at how difficult they were because they were just way above our heads. Not only that they use a lot of big words, but the sentence structures themselves were really confusing. And a lot of times we would have sentences that were the length of paragraphs. So to understand them, you really had to read and reread them multiple times. But over, as the weeks went by, after spending, many weeks reading through the texts and, discussing them with our teachers and then doing the writing assignments they had us do, which also helped with close reading. I do feel like I walked out of that program a better reader than I was walking in, but I didn't really appreciate that much until the PSAT in October. So I actually didn't do any prep for that PSAT, especially the sophomore year one, since it doesn't count for anything. Like you could get a perfect score on that and it wouldn't matter because the colleges don't even look at the sophomore year score. It's more informational for you. So I decided that I just wanted to go into the sophomore year PSAT cold because I was already familiar with the format from having done it in middle school. And I just was really curious to see how I would do without any prep. And I was really surprised to find that the reading part specifically was a lot easier than I had remembered it being before. So I think part of that had to do with age. Obviously, everything else being equal, a 10th grader is going to find the same passages easier than an 8th grader is. But I also think that I was so used to reading passages that were so much harder than that over the summer that by the time I got to reading like more normal high school level things again, it seemed really easy in comparison. And then plus all the work I did in 9th grade English, specifically reading those texts really closely, I think really helped prepare me for the reading part. So then when it came down to like take the real SAT, I only really had to study for the math because that was a part that didn't necessarily come as easily to me right away. All right, so I think that's it as far as things that I did that ended up kind of indirectly helping me with the reading section. So now I'm going to move on to 5 general things that you can do to potentially improve your reading scores. And then after that, I'll give you an overview of the book, and then we'll actually look at a real SAT passage together. So most of these will be pretty quick, except the fourth one, which I'm warning you in advance, is going to be pretty long, so I apologize. So the first thing that you can do is study vocabulary actively. So I pretty much talked about this on the last slide, so I'm not going to elaborate too much on that. Just the one thing I will add is I do recommend keeping a vocabulary journal and doing vocabulary quizzes. What I mean by a journal is as you come across words you don't know when you're doing practice tests or doing passages, in my book or some other source, write them down either in like a physical journal or preferably like a Word doc or a Google Doc, and make sure you look them up and then try to make up your own sentences with those words. And then I'd also recommend kind of quizzing yourself on them regularly. So if you see a word on one test that you don't know, there's a good chance you'll see it on another one. And this applies, I should say, not only to the reading part, but also to section 2. So the writing and language section also has some vocabulary tested in that as well. All right, so that's pretty much it for the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice also pretty much builds off of things that I did when I was in school, is you want to make sure that you're reading high-level material regularly and closely. And this could be things from inside school or outside of school. So in my case, this was mainly with work I was already being assigned in school anyway, so I didn't have to give myself double work other than the summer program I did. So you could actually just do close reading with whatever reading you're being given in school, as long as it's at a high enough level. But one thing I do recommend adding, which is something I didn't really do, is try to accompany at least some of your close reading activities with reading comprehension questions regularly. So that doesn't have to be all the activities, but at least some of them. So obviously my book is one place where you'd be able to do that, but also Khan Academy, they have quizzes that you could kind of filter by genre, and they'll give you an SAT style passage. You don't have to do a whole practice test. You could just do one passage of 11 questions. So that would be a great way if you wanted to do like a daily quiz on there. And there's also this website I discovered called Common Lit, which is really good. So I think you need a membership to access their like full curriculum, which I don't have. But even as a non-member, you could still access most of their text, and you could actually filter them both by genre and by grade level. So if you're someone, let's say, who struggles with science passages, then you might want to just do 11th and 12th grade science passages, for example. And then the third thing that you can do, which might seem a little bit odd since the test is a reading comprehension test, not a listening comprehension one, is actually work on improving your listening comprehension skills. You could do this such as by reading along with audiobooks, because that allows you to practice reading and listening comprehension together, or by listening to advanced lectures such as TED Talks or podcasts where you have educated adult speaking. So the reason I'm recommending this, and this is something I actually didn't learn about until like right before I went to Harvard, when I was kind of doing research for my application essay. So it turns out that it's generally regarded that your listening comprehension provides a ceiling for your reading comprehension. So in other words, it's almost impossible to be able to read at a higher level than you could listen. So if a student is able to, let's say, only listen to text at an 8th grade level with good comprehension, then they could probably only read text at around the 7th grade level or so with good comprehension. So if your goal is to be able to at least read at a 12th grade level really, really well, you probably want to be listening at a college level, to be honest. So in order to improve your listening comprehension skills, you actually need to listen to educated people speak using the type of advanced language that you would see on the SAT. And then one thing I just want to add about the audiobook thing. So if you do that strategy, since listening is generally, since people are better at listening than reading, I would recommend picking a book that would be slightly, but not like overly difficult for you to read if you were to just read it by yourself. So pick a book that's a little bit challenging for you if you were just to read it straight through, and then listen to that while reading along. So that could help you improve both your general language comprehension skills as well as your reading comprehension. And then I have the next two things. So the fifth one is really quick. So actually I might just skip to the fifth one really fast since it's only have like one or two things to say about that. And then I'll get to the fourth thing because that's the one that I think is probably really kind of important. I want to make sure we talk a lot about that. And then we'll start moving on to going through an SAT. So the fifth thing is really not going to apply to everybody, possibly none of you. But if depending on how you learned to read in elementary school, sometimes what happens is if you weren't taught phonics, which I believe they are bringing back to New York City now, but what happens is students are able to learn to read fine and kind of get through school. But when they got to the SAT, if they come across like a big word that's not a sight word, meaning it's a word they don't recognize, rather than sounding it out, they'll just replace it with a word that looks kind of similar to it, and it kind of throws their whole comprehension off. And I actually did see this happen a few months ago with one of my seniors I was working with, and he was actually a good student too. He was able to get like 650 on the reading, which was a big improvement for him. But there was one question where the question said corroborate, which means to support, but he misread it as collaborate because it kind of looks similar, and that those words have completely different meanings. And then he ended up getting that question wrong. So this might not apply to all of you, but that's just something to be aware of. So the fourth thing is the one that I really want to talk a good amount about before we kind of move on to looking through an SAT. So the next thing that you can do that's really important, which is kind of an underrated part of reading comprehension, is to increase your actual content knowledge in like a variety of fields like science and history. And you can do this through advanced coursework, which I'm sure hopefully many of you are already doing, and then just independent study. So a common misconception about reading, which I honestly probably had to an extent before graduate school, was that people often think of reading as just kind of like a set of skills that are like isolated skills that you could apply to any passage you read. So you're either like a good reader or you're a bad reader. Like you can decode well or you can't. You can make inferences or you can't. But the reality is a little more complicated than that. So yeah, there are some just general skills that make some students just stronger readers than others. But other factors that kind of affect the way that you engage and interpret and understand the text also have to do with your interest level in the text, like your attitudes, and also your knowledge on the topic. So some studies have actually shown that having knowledge about a topic could actually increase performance on reading comprehension tasks. So there is one like really important study that I learned about in school, where essentially readers or the researchers identified students who were previously labeled as weak readers and strong readers. And they found that the weak readers actually performed just as well as strong readers when they read a reading comprehension passage about baseball, if the weak readers already knew a lot about baseball. So they had high content knowledge on baseball, and they were able to perform just as well as the strong readers on a passage about it. But if you were to give the weak readers a passage on a topic they knew nothing about, then they would do much worse than the strong readers. So essentially having a lot of knowledge on a topic was like a cushion that made up for the fact that maybe they didn't have the best general reading skills. So that what that might mean for you is that even if you read a passage that might otherwise be a little bit difficult for you, if it happens to just randomly be on a topic that you know a lot about, you'll probably get more questions right than you otherwise would have had it been an equally difficult passage on a topic that you knew nothing about. And just from personal experience, this research seems to like echo what I've experienced. So I just know if I'm going through a passage like an SAT or an ACT one, or even the graduate school ones like the GRE, which I had to take to get into graduate school, it's definitely much easier for me to make it through a passage if I already know a little bit about the topic. And working with my students, I find that they often perform better than I would expect them to, based on how they usually do, if the passage just randomly happens to be on a topic that they know a lot about, either because they studied it in school or because it's a topic they really like and they've done their own research on it. And one cool thing about the SAT is that they actually do tend to kind of repeat the same topics over and over again. So I don't know how many of you have done a lot of prep, but the more tests you do, you'll see that certain topics kind of have a way of showing up over and over again. So like debates over like abolitionism, debates over like the history of women's rights, apartheid, passages related to memory, passages related to genetics, things like that. They tend to kind of show up over and over again. So one thing that you want to do is as you're going through practice tests, whether they're from real tests or from my book or from Khan Academy or Common Lit or wherever, actually try to learn a little bit from the passages, especially the nonfiction ones, because you never know when the knowledge that you get in those passages are actually going to come back and help you on a future one. So you want to think kind of like you're not just learning how to read, but you're also reading to learn, because your background knowledge and your reading comprehension, they kind of like reinforce each other. And then just for those of you who are curious for kind of why background knowledge seems to help students do better than they otherwise would, like I'm not a complete expert on this or anything, but from what I've learned in school and read on my own, there seem to be at least kind of two big reasons for this. So one reason has to do with just kind of the science of how we learn. So we learn better when the new information that we're learning is connected to knowledge that we already have. We're able to kind of make connections. And this is kind of goes back to a story that I mentioned my Georgetown professor who I was going to mention today. So we were actually learning about this in Georgetown, and she told us that if you were to teach her a new random fact about psychology, she would probably learn it really easily because she knows so much about psychology. She could just kind of take the new fact and put it in her web of knowledge and make sense of it and then remember it. But if you were to teach her a new random fact about something like banking, which she doesn't know anything about, she said there's a good chance she would forget it. She'd really have to put in a lot of effort to study it to make sense of it because she doesn't have that deep web of knowledge on it. So similarly, let's say if you're reading a passage that maybe is genuinely difficult for you in terms of like the structure and the vocabulary, but it's on a topic you know a lot about, you're probably going to still have a pretty easy time following the author's gist and the main points and kind of filling in the gaps of what you don't know, even if you're not necessarily understanding everything on a sentence by sentence level. And you could probably have an easier time when it comes down to answering the questions. You could use your background knowledge as kind of a tool or a scaffold to help you through. So that's kind of one reason. So having knowledge is like a tool that helps you make sense of the stuff you don't know, because you can interpret the passage better. And the other reason seems to have to do with kind of limits of human memory. So there's something called working memory, which is your memory for things that you're dealing with in the given moment. So like if I told you, do this puzzle and also remember these 5 numbers in your head, that would be using your working memory because you're trying to keep track of a lot of things in your head at a time. So when you're doing reading comprehension, that actually engages your working memory, because not only are you reading whatever you're reading like right now in the moment, but you're trying to remember how it relates to what you read a sentence before or a paragraph before. So you could kind of form like a coherent narrative, because if you forget what you read a few paragraphs ago, then you're going to have to go back and read that again and remember how that relates to what you just read now. And working memory for all humans is limited. So the more complicated a text is, just the more strain it's going to put on your working memory, the harder it's going to be to keep track of what's going on. However, if you have background knowledge on the passage, then that takes some of the pressure off your working memory, and you could rely more on your long-term memory, which is permanent and doesn't have any limit to it because it's the stuff you already know. So you'll be able to kind of work through the passage a lot more easier while keeping track of what's going on more easily. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the background part. So hopefully some of that was helpful for just things you could kind of do on your own, just more broadly to become a better reader. And this doesn't even deal with the strategies about the passages themselves, but if you have strong reading skills, and you'll be in a very good position to get a high score. And then with the strategies, then you could do definitely even better than that. So before we get to, so we're almost ready to get to the test. So I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of how the book is structured. So overall, the chapters in the book are organized by question type. So for example, there's a chapter on inferences, one on vocabulary and context, one on command of evidence. And the chapters all have notes along on like how to approach the question types, along with some model passages and sample questions. And they also have drills that include SAT-like passages in a variety of genres, which are similar to types of passages that you would see on the test. And then some chapters I just wanted to note have more warm-up style drills that help you isolate the skills at the sentence or paragraph level when appropriate to really build those close reading skills. So in the case of paired passages, for example, remember the passage 1, passage 2 things. So rather than getting right into like full-length paired passages in the drill, the first few questions are just like speaker A, speaker B drills, where some of them are even like 1 or 2 sentences each. So you could really just practice the skill of how to analyze one author's argument in relation to another without having to overload your working memory with a whole large passage. So that was it for the PowerPoint. So now I'm going to go, actually, we'll look at the very first chapter of the book, which is like it's like a mini chapter. But essentially, we're going to just talk about how to generally approach the passages and question types. So I'll try to get through that really quickly, and then we'll actually look at a real passage. All right, so here we can see that. All right, so when you're reading the passages on the SAT, it's important that you're an active reader. So we talked about active and passive learning before. So when you're reading actively, it means that you're actually really thinking about what you read as you go, and you're asking yourself questions. So things you really want to be focusing on: what is the topic of the passage? So what is the passage about? What is the purpose of the passage? So why is the author writing this? Are they trying to inform me of something? Are they trying to convince me of something? You also want to pay attention to the author's tone or attitude. So do they tend to have a more positive attitude? Are they like complimentary? Are they more critical? Are they more neutral? And if it's an argumentative piece, what arguments are they making? How are they convincing me of it? And then if it's a fiction piece, which we're reading today, you want to pay attention to who the characters are, how they feel about each other, how they relate to one another, what their emotions are and their thoughts. Overall, though, your first read through should mainly be focused on the big picture. You don't want to get too caught up in minute details. You more just want to understand the gist of what's going on, because you always could go back to the passage after. And as far as steps to answering the question, so I'll go through this pretty fast because I don't want it today to go too long. So first, you want to make sure you read the information above the passage, which not every passage does, but if it does have that, then it's usually important information. Sorry, just didn't mean to do that. Then you want to read actively, which you talked about. So once you actually get to the questions, you want to make sure you find where in the passage you need to look to answer the questions. So don't try to overly rely on your memory unless it's like a really big picture question or a really easy one. So first, like try to find in the text where the information is and you need to answer it before kind of jumping to a conclusion. The next thing you want to do is before you look at the answer choices, if possible, try to make a prediction in your own words what the answer should be. It's okay if your prediction's wrong, but just doing this is just an added safeguard that will make you less likely to pick certain wrong answer choices that might otherwise kind of distract you. Especially if your prediction does turn out to be right, then you just want to make sure that every word in the answer choice you pick makes sense and can't be disproved. So like if an answer choice says suggests that a theory is flawed, you should be able to identify what that theory is. And then 6, I'm not going to really talk too much about this, but if you have issues with timing, you might want to consider doing the passages in the order that they seem interesting to you. Also, that might build your confidence if you do the easier passages first, and the passages that interest you and that you know most about, remember, are ones you're most likely to do well on. And then I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the 5 common wrong answer types, and then we'll actually look at a passage. So the first type is probably pretty self-explanatory, opposite or illogical answers. So these are answer choices that are actually directly contradicted by the passage. Maybe they take like a true detail, but then like twist it around to make it not true. So the passage literally tells us these are wrong. Then there are wrong degree answer choices. So these are answer choices, they might be in the same general direction as the right answer, but they're either too extreme or they're not extreme enough. So they might be positive or negative correctly, but they're to the wrong extent. So an example of that might be, let's say the author describes a policy that really like outrages them, such as like slavery, like we're going to read about in one of the passages on this test. So if
Douglas, a little bit larger. I just want everyone to see it. Is that okay? Just make the actual passage larger.
Oh yeah, this.
Zoom out, which yeah, larger.
Okay.
Or maybe just Control Plus.
Hold on, let me just see. Is that
view? Go to the view page. You could go to view. View is like on the right, and just make, yeah, that's good. Let's make it like good. Okay,
right. Good. All right. So then, so basically wrong degree choice, like I was saying, they use language that's either too positive or too negative, or that might be too weak. So an example would be if an author described, let's say, a policy that they were really strongly against, like slavery, for example, and an answer choice said mildly annoyed, that's probably not strong enough language if they're saying it's like a really strong injustice. And then other passages, they might use language that's too strong when they're take a more mild tone. So you want to pay attention to not just positive or negative, but the degree. The third type, which is probably a common wrong answer type that trips people up, are outside information choices. So these choices, they tell you things that they might be true. They just aren't, there's not enough evidence in the passage to tell us if they are or not. So we don't know yet. And then unreal answers, this is probably more applicable to some of the nonfiction passage, but if an answer choice doesn't make sense in the real world, then it's probably not true. So like if you see an answer that says history provides no useful knowledge to scholars, that obviously doesn't make sense in the real world, so it's probably not right. And then the last type are true but irrelevant details. So these are details that are actually true, but they just aren't relevant to answering what the question is asking. All right. So now we will get to the actual passage. So sorry, today's going to go a little bit over time.
So I think we're safe to say we're going to go a bit over. So is 8:15 safe? Is that a good time to say we'll stop then?
Yeah, I think definitely between 8:15 and 8:20, probably.
Okay. All right, it's no day anyway.
We're just doing one passage, so.
All right.
Yeah, I was going to do 2 originally, but I thought that would take too long. So I'm glad we did 1 because we did that extra kind of introduction at the beginning. So that's fine. We'll just do this first passage. All right. So here, remember I told you if you see context above a passage, you want to make sure that you read it. Let me just see if I can
And
make it a little
get
bigger.
large, but it's
Yeah.
like good.
Is that hold on? It's on OneNote. Sorry, I think that's like the largest I could make it. Okay, is that better?
We're good. Maybe larger, larger.
Okay, I think that should be
Sorry.
better.
I like the monstrosity effects.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
All right. So here it says the narrator describes acting in silent films in the early 1900s. So we know the narrator's an actor. We know he acted during this time period. And they tell us that Moran owns a production company that employs a narrator. So that's important because we know who the actual, who Moran is when he's mentions that's a narrator's boss. All right, so we'll start reading through this and I'll kind of model, like, remember focusing on big ideas. And I'll kind of model for you like points where it would be okay to more, what do you call it, skim a little bit more. So it says here, it is amusing in retrospect to think how primitive our efforts were in those early years. So we know he's like talking back about the past because he says the word retrospect. He says their efforts were primitive in those early years. So he's probably writing from sometime in the future. We don't know exactly when. For my first two films, all of the interiors were shot on outdoor sets with canvases draped over them to soften the sun. All copies of Jamestown Junction have long been lost, but if the film had survived and if you could see it, you would notice that during the office scene, the papers on my desk are disturbed by a mysterious breeze. And in the very next scene, you would see a shadow moving in the corner caused by the canvas flapping in the wind. So again, we kind of see these issues caused by filming outdoors because we see like wind causing things to blow that were supposed to be an indoor scene. So these were the conditions in which we shot at the time. And because we worked without the benefit of artificial light, there was always a rush to complete the day's filming before the shadows grew too deep in the afternoon. So at this point, we already kind of have a good idea of what the main idea is for right now, that they kind of filmed in pretty rough conditions, like they were filming outdoor scenes indoors. So now if you were doing this as your first read, you could kind of just skim until you notice a change in the narrative. So you could kind of skim through anything where they're just talking about poor conditions because they already got the gist of that. So in late May, when we endured an unexpected heat wave, Moran had giant ice blocks delivered to the sets and powerful fans placed behind them to blow the cool air in the direction of the players. If it rained, filming would halt altogether and we would scramble to move all the furniture and props under the complex's few permanent roofs. But despite these challenges, so now I'm going to slow down a little bit because I see kind of the contrast transition that's signaling a change. Everyone remained in good spirits. We were working, yes, but it felt like play. And it was hard to comprehend the tremendous good fortune that had suddenly befallen me. So we see kind of a clue about the narrator's emotion. So if I'm just thinking, okay, big picture, like what is going on here? So I kind of wrote some notes at the side. So for the first part, I would say film conditions were poor, but the actors were in good spirits and the narrator felt lucky to work. So those are probably the things that you want to like really take out of that first read through. All right, so let's go. All right. So through the making of both films, Hanoko, so I see a new character being introduced, so I want to pay attention to that, gave me constant guidance, which I eagerly accepted. All right, and I immediately discerned the difference between myself, an untrained amateur, and a seasoned professional who knew everything about the art of acting. Indeed, she was perhaps the largest influence in my development as an actor. So this seems like a pretty important point, that this character, Hanoko, had the largest influence on his development as an actor. We know she gave him constant guidance. He seems to be implying that she was a professional while he was an amateur. So we kind of understand that Hanoko is a really good actor and she seemed to be helping the narrator become a better actor himself. And we know she gave him guidance. So now that we kind of have that main idea, we could kind of skim through anything that we see that just kind of supports that, that are more detail oriented. So we actually see the next passage, the next two paragraphs just kind of give you an example of advice she's giving him. So we could just kind of skim through those through now. There is no audience to see you, she said one day in Japanese, as I gestured expansively to convey my anguish at the death of one of my fellow soldiers. You don't need to project like you would in a theater as if you're trying to be seen by the person in the last row. Pretend the camera is the woman you're playing to. On another occasion, when I was perhaps too understated, Hanoko approached me after Moran called cut. You're painting a picture of your body. Think of pantomime. You must express physically what you can with your voice and use your face, your eyes. You have such eyes alone that speak volumes. So these just kind of show examples of her like coaching the narrator. So in one case, he was overacting. In the other case, if anything, he seemed to be underacting. So now we kind of get to a new section. So Moran, remember, is the narrator's boss, nodded in agreement, although he couldn't have understood, and I adjusted my actions accordingly. I was surprised by the extent to which he let Hinoko direct things, not only my own performance, but also the placement of props, even the movements of other actors. Yet all of her suggestions improved the films, and between her advice and Moran's direction, I was slowly learning what to do. So if you want to kind of take some notes here, so we have section 2, Hinoko guided the narrator, had a big impact on his development as an actor. And now we see that she even got to kind of direct Moran, who was the boss, and made suggestions that improved the film. And now he's making this next point that's going to be important. So the transition from theater, which depends on dialogue, was more difficult than I had imagined. Indeed, many stage actors, even those who didn't disdain the new medium of moving pictures, did not make the change successfully. Hinoko Minatoya was one of the few who was equally accomplished at both realms. So both realms meaning the stage as well as film. I was learning under her tutelage or guidance every day. So that's like another big SAT word. So again, why it's important that you kind of study words. We see he was learning under her guidance every day. And then I think I added one other note here, how, yeah, section 3. Oh, sorry, let me scroll up. So one of the few actors who mastered a transition. So Hinoko was one of the few actors who mastered a transition from stage to film, and the narrator learned under her guidance. So that's kind of the next broad point. And now we're going to get into the last kind of major section, and then we'll get into the questions. So on certain days when we weren't in scenes, Hinoko and I would leave sets and walk into the hills. So the next part just kind of describes the scenery. You could really skim through that. They were vibrant color with flowers wherever one looked, blue rhodea and lupin, mariposa lilacs, wispy orange California poppies. The beauty of the landscape when the air was cool, the sun glinting off the ocean, the breeze carrying the scent of the flowers was so dramatic, I could hardly believe it was real. And I was seeing it, feeling it in the company of an artist whose work I admired for years. So you see, that's something that's like not that important detail. So in the real test, I would kind of read through that really, really quickly. One day on our walk, we were discussing a well-known actor, and Hinoko surprised me by her reaction to his name. He is nothing but a face for fan magazines, she said dismissively. He is not a genuine actor. What do you mean, I asked, although I didn't disagree. It is impossible to distinguish one of his roles from another. He is always the same, and it is obvious why. In order to project a believable fiction, the actor himself must have substance. You must possess something internally to perform it externally. He only has a fraction of the talent of an artist such as you. I was, of course, deeply flattered by her compliment, and I did not know how to respond. Hinoko continued talking to this actor and that without noting my reaction. So we're going to end up having a few questions on this section. So basically, the key takeaway is that they were talking about a popular actor, and Hinoko seemed very critical of him. The narrator wanted to know more about why. She basically said that good actors need to possess something internally and have substance to do well. And she ended up complimenting the narrator himself that that actor wasn't as good as him, and it flattered him. So if I were to like say key points, it would just be Hinoko criticizes a popular actor, says the actor needs substance to perform well. She praises the narrator, and he's flattered. So these are just kind of like big takeaways to get. So now we will actually get into answering the questions, and this should probably only take around 10 minutes or so. So, and some of these are question pairs. So the first question is a vocabulary and context question. So we actually have 2 of those. So I just want to talk about how to answer those in general. So this is like questions 1 and 6. So for vocabulary and context questions, you'll be asked what a certain word means. So you want to look for context clues in the surrounding lines and predict the meaning of the word in your own words before looking at the answer choices. And you should know that they often pick words that have multiple true meanings. So you can't just go by your background knowledge. You actually have to look at the context and see which word makes sense. So we want to know what the word primitive means in line 2. So we're just going to actually go back to that section and just kind of read the surrounding lines and try to predict in our own words roughly what it should mean. And then we'll look at the choices. And it's okay if our actual prediction isn't the actual right one or in the those exact phrasing. So he says it's amusing to think how primitive their efforts were in those early years. So I'm already thinking like, well, it has to be something that's amusing. So I'm thinking, why would it be amusing for their efforts to be primitive? So that's kind of a first little clue. And it says for the first, for those first 2 films, they talked about how the interiors were shot on outdoor sets. And then remember, they talked about how the problems that caused. So in Jamestown Junction, They talked about how like there's a scene where the papers on his desk were disturbed by the mysterious breeze, and that's because they were filming indoor sets that were actually taking place outdoors. The next scene, there was a shadow moving in the corner caused by the canvas flapping in the wind. And he talks about how these were like the types of conditions that they shot in. Then he goes on to describe kind of the other sort of disasters that they encountered on set. So if I was going to just try to predict in my own words why he's describing their efforts as primitive, I'm thinking probably means something like basic or not high tech or like not very modern. Like overall, it doesn't seem like this is a very professional setting, at least in terms of like the setting that they're using. So I'm thinking it's probably very like basic, not high tech, not very modern. Their efforts, we know that overall their product does not look the most professional. So probably something having to do with that. So then if I look at the choices, I see that basic is a choice. That's one of the words I predicted. So that'll be work, right? So their efforts are pretty basic. They weren't making a production that looked particularly professional. Number 2, the narrator references Jamestown Junction primarily in order to what? So this is an example of a part-whole structure question. So I'll go to how to answer those. So these questions might ask you what function an example serves in a passage. So to answer these questions in general, you first want to determine what the author is literally saying when they're mentioning the example. And then you want to see how that example relates to the surrounding lines or the passage as a whole. So actually all that work that we just did to answer number 1 is going to help us figure out the answer to number 2. So we remember how we talked about how their efforts were really primitive or basic. And then he gave Jamestown Junction as an example of a film in which their efforts were basic. Remember how they were filming the outdoor scenes or indoor scenes outdoors and was causing all these problems. And then the author made a broader point, or the narrator made a broader point about how these were the types of conditions in which they filmed. So if I were to just kind of predict in my own words why he's mentioning this film, I would say something like, it's an example of a film in which they filmed in poor conditions, or it's an example of a film in which they had primitive efforts and they faced a lot of problems. And then I'm thinking kind of about the wind scene. So now looking at the choices, I see that this seems to go really nicely with choice D, showcase the challenges posed by filming in an outdoor setting. Remember all the issues that the wind caused. So that seems to work. There doesn't seem to be anything about A. He's not saying they're trying to imitate the acting. Nothing about tensions on set. Remember, everyone was in good spirits. And there's nothing about the responsibilities of directors versus the actors in that particular part. So D seems to work best. Number 3 is a perspective question or point of view question. So the way you answer those is first, you want to determine who the narrator is. And you want to look for clues about their purpose or attitude. So not only who is a narrator, but how do they seem to actually kind of feel? So we already know that the narrator is an actor talking about his early career. And remember, he's talking about the early days kind of amusing their effort. So even though they had poor conditions, he still looks at it almost humorously. Then he makes this big point about how they were in good spirits, even though they had these challenges. And then he spends the rest of the passage basically praising Hanoko for making him such a great actor. Something overall, his attitude seems to be pretty positive. So if I were to make a prediction, I'd say the narrator is an actor who's kind of reflecting on his early days of his career, like very positively. And that seems to go very nicely with D. So if you're nostalgic for something, it means you're longing for the past. And he is talking about the beginning of his career. A and B, we see are way too negative because remember, he's a positive attitude. C, well, maybe he's enthusiastic. He's not really talking about recent technological developments in his profession. He's more talking about the past. And anything, he's kind of talking about the challenging technology. So D would be right for 3. And then number 4 and 5 is actually one of our paired questions. So this is when you have one question followed by another question where you have to pick the line numbers that help you answer it. So a common mistake students make on this question type is they try to do the first answer first. And then if they pick the wrong answer, then they try to twist one of the other quotes to kind of fit the answer they originally chose. I actually recommend not answering the original question first, unless it's really obvious. So usually when I'm doing these, I always look at the quotes first and see which ones are possibly relevant. And then I try to see which of those quotes seem to have a match, a close match with something in the original pair. And then just, I have some general advice. So if 2 quotes seem to support the right answer, you want to pick the one that most directly supports it completely. And then if more than one choice seems to have a match, like if there seem to be multiple matches, first make sure that pick the match that's most relevant to the original question. And also make sure that the match is actually a match, because sometimes a choice might seem like a match, but it's not actually one. So in this question, a common wrong answer people put, oh, so let's actually read the question. So it can most reasonably inferred from the passage that as a young man, the narrator attributed his employments in film to what? So attributed means assigned. So another way of asking this is, why did a narrator basically think he was employed? So a common wrong answer people put is D, his friendship with Hanoko, because the passage talks a lot about that. And they typically match it with either quote C or D, which if we go back to that part of the passage, he's kind of talking about the guidance Hanoko gave him. The problem is though, the question's asking why the narrator thought he was employed, but he already was employed by the time Hanoko was helping him. So Hanoko, he credits with helping him become a better actor, but not with being hired in the first place. So that's why D, this would be kind of a misused detail. So if we go to the quotes first, though, we're less likely to make that error. So if we look at quote A first, in lines 11 to 15, there he's just kind of talking about the poor filming conditions they had. That doesn't seem to really be that important. But if we look at 24 to 26, he says, we were working, yes, but it felt like play. And it was hard to comprehend the tremendous good fortune that had suddenly befallen me. So he's saying their work felt like play and it was like good luck. So that seems to really go nicely with choice C in number 4. It was good luck or lucky happenstance, good fortune. So he seems to think he was hired because of good luck. All right, this should only take us a few more minutes. These will be pretty quick. 6 is another vocab and context. So we'll do that the same way that we did number 1. Try to see what convey would mean in line 35. So again, we'll read the sentence over and then try to predict. So here he's talking about the scene, remember, where he kind of overacted and Hanoko was advising him. So she goes, there is no audience to see you, she said one day in Japanese, as I gestured expansively or like broadly to convey my anguish at the death of one of my fellow soldiers. You don't need to project like you would in the theater as if you're trying to be seen by the person in the last row. Pretend the camera is the only man you're playing to. So if I had to predict what convey means, he's talking about in the context of acting. So I'd say he's trying to signal, and anguish we know is like suffering. So it looks like he's trying to signal or communicate his anguish, but he's doing so kind of in an over-the-top way. And I look at the choices and I see communicate is right. So I put that. And then 7 and 8, another question pair. So we'll do that the same way we did for 4 and 5. So based on the passage, in what way does Hanoko most directly influence the narrator's development? So even before looking at the choices, I know it's probably going to have to do something with making him a better actor. Like we see here, he talks about her being the biggest influence on his professional development. He goes on to talk about the advice he gave him, how she was one of the few people who was good at making the transition from stage to film, and how he learned under her tutelage. So I know the right answer is probably going to be somewhere in that general section, from there, somewhere to there. And it turns out to be that way. So if I read 53 to 56, yet all of her suggestions improve the films, and between her advice and Moran's direction, I was slowly learning what to do. So I'm thinking maybe he is learning what to do from her, but it also mentions Moran's direction. It's a little bit of a vague choice, so I'll say maybe I'll keep that for now, but I'll see if there's another choice that's a little bit stronger than that. If I look at 61 to 63, Hanoko Minatoya was one of the few who was equally accomplished in both realms, and I was learning under her tutelage every day. So tutelage is like her leadership or guidance. So that basically seems to be saying everything that choice A was saying, but even more detail. So that's definitely seems to be stronger language. So I'm thinking that seems like a really good choice. And that seems to match actually really nicely with C. She learns the same lessons learned from having made the same career shift he's making. The thing that might throw people off is that they said the word both realms. So if you read the sentence before, though, it clarifies what's meant by both realms. Remember how most actors struggled to transition from theater to film, but Hanoko was good in both. So that's what they meant by both realms. It was films and theater. So Hanoko was one of the few people who was good in both of these domains. So that would end up being the question pair. And then just looking at the other choices just to be safe, 64 to 66 just says how they used to go for walks in the hills. That's clearly not saying anything that important. D, though, I do want to point out, because not a lot of people, but some people put choice D and 8, and they matched that with A. So 89 to 90 says that he was deeply flattered by her compliment. And some people match that with she praises his skills as an actor to boost his confidence. So I would call that kind of a false match and a misused detail. Because one, it seemed like she was praising him to be genuine, not to boost his confidence, just because she just felt like making a compliment. So it's not even clear it's really a match. But also, even if you can see that A and D are a match with each other, it's not really as big an influence on his development as the fact that she helped him become a better actor, because that's overall what the narrator stresses more. All right, we just have 2 questions left, and these will be really quick. We can do these in like 2 minutes. So number 9 is probably the easiest question type, which are detail questions. And we know that because it has the word indicates, meaning the answer is right in the passage. So the passage indicates that when Hanoko criticizes a well-known actor, the narrator what's? So to answer detail questions, all you do is you locate the right answer in the passage and put it in your own words, then look at the choices. So we actually see that right at the end. So we see here the narrator, sorry, Hanoko criticizes the narrator, not the narrator, the actor around here. And then the narrator reacts by saying, "What do you mean? I asked, although I didn't disagree." So we know he wants her to kind of expand on why he thinks that actor is bad, but he didn't disagree, which is just a fancy way of saying he did agree. If he didn't disagree, he did agree. So that would go with nicely with B. He concurs with Hanoko's opinion. So concur means agree, but is curious her reasoning because he does ask why. So in this choice, this is where vocabulary comes in play. So one of my students this week actually got this question wrong because she didn't know that concurs and agree meant the same thing. So D we know is wrong because she doesn't disagree. He doesn't seem disappointed because remember, he does agree. A, sometimes people might fall for, obviously he's happy to be complimented by her, but I wouldn't necessarily say relieved. And also there's no evidence that he actually feared she would address him with criticism. Because remember, they were just talking about the other narrator, not the other narrator, the other actor, and Hanoko kind of mentioned the narrator randomly. So it wasn't like he was expecting her to criticize him. And then finally, we'll finish off with number 10. So this is an inference question. So it can most reasonably be inferred from the passage Hanoko believes an actor's merit depends on what? So the answer inference questions, it's pretty similar. So you locate the information, but in this case, there's only a hint for the right answer rather than it being told you very directly. So you'll read kind of the hint and then try to predict what's most implied. So where we read that is actually right in the very next paragraph. So when she's criticizing the actor, she says, you can't distinguish one of his roles from another. He's always the same and it's obvious why. But to project a believable fiction, the actor must have substance. He must possess something internally to perform it externally. So my prediction would be that an actor needs to have substance or depth in order to perform well, and they can't always kind of be the same in every role. And then if I look at the choices in 10, sorry, I don't know why this is doing it, that would seem to go very nicely with B, depth or substance of feelings and perceptions. There really doesn't seem to be anything going along with C or D. The only answer choice that sometimes people, the wrong choice that people are most likely to put for this one is A. And I think that's partially because remember, the narrator praises Hanoko for being a mentor to him. So she might think that you need good training, and she probably would agree you need good training, but she doesn't actually talk about that directly. So there's more evidence for B. So A might be something that could help you become better, but what's actually required is that you have depth of perceptions. Doesn't necessarily matter how you get that. All right, and that was it. So we're done for today. So thank you again for having me, and hopefully that was helpful. Apologize for going over time.
Douglas, everyone give Douglas a huge thank you. Douglas, can you hit unmute for everyone just because I'm multitasking right now? Can you just hit unmute? Everyone give Douglas a big thank you, okay? Just because I'm doing one thing at once, I can't do it right now, okay? Go ahead, give him a huge thank you. Unmute. Can you hit unmute for everybody?
I don't know where I don't
everybody, 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Douglas.
Right,
Do you guys hear?
I don't see how I can unmute everybody.
Go to participants and then go to unmute.
Sorry, I don't participants.
I'll do it.
Yeah, just do it.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Wait, let's do it in 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Douglas.
Thank you.
Douglas, the bestest. You're a
having
child genius. You helped us so much. Thank you for doing this. I'm really happy that I forced you to do this. And aren't you glad that I did that? Okay. I wanted to bring a face to the genius behind the books. So I'm very happy that we did this. Okay. And I'm really proud. This is recorded. This is going to show up in the Kweller Prep channel. Okay, everyone, you saw it. And that's it. Let's give Douglas one last thank you, and then we're going to finish up. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Douglas. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you for having
Okay,
me.
everyone. Thank you. Bye, Douglas. Thank you. You can hit end meeting, okay?
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Douglas. This was super, super helpful. We learned a lot. This was really, really great. And thank you for giving us your time and your sincerity and your honesty. That was super helpful because now we know, now we know what we need to know on how you scored so well. All right. Thank you, Douglas. All right. You can end the meeting. Okay.
Bye.
Right. I just want to, everyone, again, say, Douglas, you are awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. Go ahead, Douglas. You're good. Okay.
Great. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good snow day.